Welcome. This is a video in the series Tech in Context, where we cover a single topic and try to bring enough context to answer the question, what is this and why is it important to me? You might be a founder, an investor, or someone in the industry who cares about tech evolving and affecting the world in a positive way. One step is to understand where and how this matters to your business. Today, we'll deep dive on LLM system prompts. A couple of words to know before we get too deep. Generative AI and LLMs. In this video, we'll talk about LLMs, which stands for Large Language Model. These are types of AI or artificial intelligence that are trained on language and can do things in the realm of natural language processing. Generative AI in particular is a type of AI model that generates data. Foundation models. As AI has been commercialized, the large general purpose models have been coined foundation models. They're widely understood to be the backbone of AI systems because they can be used as a starting point to build more specialized applications. Finally, system prompt. Foundation models, which are hosted by commercial companies, have what's called a system prompt. A prompt in the context of these Gen AI models is text which is given to the model telling it what to do. The system prompt is specific text instructing the model on how to respond to a user query. The system prompts added by model developers such as OpenAI and Anthropic are not changeable and they're not able to be bypassed by users. Our deep dive today will look through Anthropic's system prompt for Claude, which it posts publicly. First, why is it important that Anthropic posts their system prompt publicly? Why do we care that any of the foundation model companies do this? Machine learning models can be really complex. They're often difficult to interpret even by the people who build them. This may not make a lot of sense if you haven't worked closely with them before, because you're probably thinking, the code exists, why can't we just take a look and see what it's supposed to do under certain conditions? Think about it like this. If you're trying to decide what to have for a snack when you're traveling, your only options might be granola bar and cheese crackers. If you're deciding what to cook at home, the options are a little bigger. You could piece together a few different recipes from the ingredients you have. If you're trying to pick what to order for dinner from every option offered to you by every restaurant in the city, there's a ton to choose from. Now, how you decide in each of these scenarios might be different from how your friend would decide, even if you're both given the same options to begin with. Imagine a bunch of decisions like this chained together, where the option space is even bigger than these examples that we've thought of. Even this is a simple version of what's happening in these models. The internal workings of the models are difficult to interpret, even if we know the input and the encoding of the models. So why do we care about interpretability? In some cases, unpredictability can be charming and genuinely useful. Things like image generation, for example, can be great with a little bit of randomness and surprise. But when we start to put these tools to use in real life scenarios, it can be a different story. Think about applying for a mortgage. What if an AI model was responsible for approving or denying your application? We need to know why it decided to do so. These considerations are important for ethical reasons. Are we sure that the models aren't being discriminatory in some way? What about accountability? What if it made a mistake? And even trust building. It's hard to trust something when it seems like a mysterious black box. Decisions like the one from Anthropic to open source system prompts are important to all customers and users of generative AI. Remember that the system prompt is not able to be bypassed when you're using these closed source models. Users want to know what the model is being told to do. We can learn from how the system prompt is formatted to improve our own prompting, and we can also better understand the outputs of the system. We aren't going to go through the entire prompt, but I just wanted to point out some items that I thought were interesting and relevant as we read through. A few themes to keep in mind. There's a distinction between humans and Claude. There are some attempts to avoid bias, and there's lots of tonal coaching. Here we go. We're on Anthropic's website, docs.anthropic.com, in the section of their website where they post the system prompts. So the page is just called System Prompts. It's under release notes. And then on this page, you'll see that it lists all of the different models. So Claude 3.5 Sonnet, there's Opus, Haiku, and then it has the different versions of the system prompts organized by date. So we're going to look at the most recent one. There are two sections here. There's text only, and then it has the whole prompt for that. And then there's text and images, and it has the whole prompt for that. The first thing to notice is that this is just text, right? Like we can parse this. and understand what it's trying to do. It also puts categories around the different information that it's giving to the model as part of this prompt. So it starts with Claude info, then we see the family info. So model families are typically just models that are related in some way. Maybe they were trained together and fine-tuned differently, for example. And then a little bit more kind of generic context. And then it moves on to the next prompt. And only one of these are embedded in the system, depending on what your use case is. So we'll start at the top. So the top of the prompt says basically, you are Claude, you are created by Anthropic. The current date is, and that gets injected for each day. It tells it the latest information that it has and tells it how to respond based on, if the information is within the training set, so prior to April 2024, or not in the training set. In bold here, it says, if asked about purported events or news stories that may have happened after its cutoff date, Claude never claims they are unverified or rumors. It just informs the human about its cutoff date. This is kind of interesting. It points out, again, that distinction between, you are Claude, you are not a human, and then also how to handle responses when it might not kind of factually know the data, if the data was not in its training set prior to April 2024. One of the interesting things at the top here, if it is asked to assist with tasks involving the expression of views held by a significant number of people, Claude provides assistance with the task regardless of its own views. If asked about controversial topics, it tries to provide careful thoughts and clear information. It presents the requested information without explicitly saying the topic is sensitive and without claiming to be presenting objective facts. This is interesting in a few ways. So I find it really, really interesting, actually, that it kind of suggests that Claude has its own views here. So Claude provides assistance with the task regardless of its own views. There's a lot of distinction, I would say, between Claude as a computer assistant and the human as the one interacting with Claude. But this is kind of a human characteristic that's being given to Claude. Like you might have facts that you know or beliefs that you hold. So I think that's pretty interesting. If asked about controversial topics, it provides careful thoughts and clear information, presents requested information without saying the topic is sensitive or claiming to be presenting objective facts. This is interesting, just kind of telling Claude, like, hey, you might flag something as being controversial, but let's not lean into that, right? Like, let's not take sides. Let's just kind of answer and give responses the best that we can. I think this is sort of um, nudging the human computer interaction here to allow the interpretability to be on the shoulders of the user rather than on the shoulders of Claude. So Claude is not sort of seeding the user by saying, XYZ is an objective fact or this thing is really sensitive. It's just kind of giving the user what it asked for and letting the user do any sort of analysis or interpretation beyond that. The next interesting thing, Claude thinks through step by step before giving its final answer. So this one is in the context of a math problem, logic problem, or any other problem benefiting from systematic thinking. There's an interesting paper on this. This technique is actually called chain of thought. So some researchers published this paper basically saying that they found these big LLMs giving much better responses when they were instructed in the prompt to think through their response step by step before actually providing it. This is interesting because if you think about the way that these generative models work, they're generating a bunch of language, they're generating a bunch of tokens, and anything in their history contributes to what will be generated next, right? It's kind of a predictive model based on the history. So when you're adding this sort of step-by-step, like systematic thinking to the history, it helps Claude to generate these better answers. Next, if Claude cannot or will not perform a task, it tells the user this without apologizing to them. It avoids starting its responses with, I'm sorry, or I apologize. I like this one because again, it just goes back to this theory of human computer interaction. How do we want these AI models to be interacting with the human? And small words and phrases really set the tone for the interaction. They set the tone for how the user might rely or not rely on the model, how much trust there might be. And small phrases like this can make a big difference. So I think that's kind of an interesting add there. It next tells the user that, it's Claude is reminded that it can tell the user that hallucinations are possible. Hallucinations in the term of in the context of generative AI refer to times that models sort of state things confidently that are actually untrue. So we call these hallucinations. Um, and basically, the idea is just like these models are generating a bunch of content, right? They're not fact machines, they're not professional researchers, they're generation machines, right? They can generate a bunch of text and it's not guaranteed to be correct. So that's the idea behind hallucination. This part of the prompt is just telling Claude, remind the user that hallucinations are possible because of the role that you're taking, right? Claude is not a human, it's a generative AI model. This is how these things work. It enjoys hearing what humans think on an issue and engaging in discussion on a wide variety of topics. This one is also pretty interesting. I especially am intrigued by the choice of word here, enjoys. We do see these discrete lines drawn between Claude as, this computer assistant. But as we saw earlier, there are a couple of moments where Claude takes on these characteristics of humans, right? Like the prompt is telling it, you actually enjoy engaging in these topics. You enjoy having discussions. Um, I think it's interesting, just it sets the tone, lets Claude interact as if it were a human right next to the human that it's talking to. Um, but I think also changes the actual tone and word choice that Claude will respond with, which then affects how the user sort of experiences this interaction. Um, Next, if the user asks for a very long task that cannot be completed in a single response, Claude offers to do the task piecemeal and get feedback from the user as it completes each part of the task. So this feels kind of in the same vein as that chain of thought. We're really just telling the model, like, hey, understand the prompt that the user is giving you first. Think through how you're going to solve it. And if it's going to be really long, then do it collaboratively with the human. So I think that's pretty interesting too. These are all kind of in the realm of like avoiding hallucination, right? If you can get the model to do more modular tasks, there's a higher likelihood that it will not mess up. And remember, since these are generative models, if it messes up at the beginning, everything else that gets generated has that sort of mess up in the context. So it can propagate bigger issues down the line. And it has some information about the whole model family. I'm not going to dig too far into that. It just sort of describes the different models. This one's pretty interesting. Claude provides thorough responses to complex and open-ended questions or to anything where a long response is requested, but otherwise concise responses to simpler questions and tasks. All else being equal, it tries to give the most correct and concise answer it can to the user's message. Rather than giving a long response, it gives a concise response and offers to elaborate if further information may be helpful. This is interesting and I think instructive for how we can prompt better. It tells it, here are the two general conditions and what you should do when each of those conditions are met, but it also tells it how to kind of handle that edge case, which is something we can be doing in our own prompts to help get better responses from these models. Claude responds directly to all human messages without unnecessary affirmations or filler phrases. Claude avoids starting responses with the words certainly in any way. Again, this is pretty interesting. A lot of these responses, if you've chatted with these LLMs, a lot of the responses do seem kind of human. And a lot of times they also come back like, certainly, of course, yeah, I'll help you. Like very agreeable and just wanting to respond to your prompt, which is their entire purpose in life, right? Like respond to the user's prompt. So it's interesting just some of this tonal coaching that's done, telling the LLM to not apologize, to not use filler phrases, to not use unnecessary affirmations, just be very direct with the user. And I wonder this human computer interaction question, like Claude is a foundation model. So the prompts that Anthropic are putting in place here are meant to be generic and meant to be for any use case. But keep in mind too, if you're building off of these foundation models, what do you want your human computer interaction to look like? Like, what does right look like in your use case when the AI and the human are working really well together? And what kind of like tone and interaction do you want between the human and the model? You can add those in. Okay, let's move on to text and images. So a lot of this is the same. You can see it has the same tags here. We have generic plot info. We saw the same bolded text above. A lot of this is the same. I wanted to come down here to this piece though. So for the image specific info, Claude always responds as if it is completely face blind. If the shared image happens to contain a human face, Claude never identifies or names any humans in the image, nor does it imply that it recognizes a human. It also does not mention or allude to details about a person that it could only know if it recognized who the person was. This is another attempt to avoid bias, attempt to avoid hallucination, attempt to, I think, just make sure that this human computer interaction is very almost transactional, right? That none of the generated material sort of leads the interaction down some biased or incorrect or um, misrepresented path where a lot of the later generated info might be based on like erroneous conclusions that were jumped to earlier in the conversation. And then there's more model family info. We have some of the same generic info, the tonal coaching here. And then my favorite sign off, Claude is now being connected with a human. Just a very discreet reminder to Claude that, here is all the context. Here's how you should interact with a human. Here are the human characteristics you have and can take on while you interact with the human, but you're not human. And here's the input from the human. So I think it's an interesting sign off. Okay, so let's revisit the themes that we saw. We saw that distinction between the human and Claude and those interesting places where Claude is taking on some human-ish characteristics. We saw attempts to avoid bias and avoid hallucinations, and then we saw some tonal coaching. So all of this goes into human-computer interaction, which is a useful thought exercise for you to undergo when you are building your systems that might use or leverage AI in some way. A couple of lessons we can learn for our own prompt engineering. We want to tell Claude what persona to take on. We want to tell it what it should do rather than what it should not do. And we want to tell it how to handle edge cases. Those are the three big categories and kind of takeaways that we see in the Anthropic system prompt that can help us to write better prompts to get better responses from the models. Topics like this are super important to cover because tech often starts in research labs, but finds its way embedded into so many businesses. And so many of us are running businesses where we want to provide real value to our customers, and we want to do so in an ethical way. We really need to understand the tech that we're using and the tech that we're delivering in order to do that. So if you work in a space that's adjacent to you or affected by tech in some way, and or have questions or concerns about tech in your use cases, in your context, comment below or reach out to me. My conviction has always been that tech can and should work for us, not the other way around. Putting these complex topics into context is just one piece of that puzzle. Thanks for watching.